At 3 in the morning on 6 September 1866, a man named John Key stood on the deck of a ship called the Ariel off Dungeness and signaled for a pilot. He had been at sea for 99 days. He had sailed 14,000 miles from a river anchorage in China around the Cape of Good Hope up the whole length of the Atlantic. And when the light came up, he looked astern and saw a sail. It was the Taping. She had left the same river on the same tide, and after 99 days of open ocean, she was close enough that Key could read her. The two ships raced up the English Channel at 14 knots with every scrap of canvas they owned. They took tugs off Deal. They went up the Thames on the same tide, and because the Taping drew a little less water, she got through her dock gates first and tied up 20 minutes ahead. A third ship, the Sarika, docked an hour and a quarter after that. 3 ships, same tide out of China, same tide into London, less than 2 hours between them after 3 months at sea. Now here's the part worth sitting with. What were they carrying? Dried leaves. 12,000 chests of them, loaded in 4 days, and a bonus written into the bill of lading for whoever landed the first of the new season's crop. Men had built the fastest sailing ships ever made and hired the best navigators alive and driven them through the roaring 40s in the dark under full sail for leaves. And that wasn't an eccentricity. That was the system. By then, this leaf had already been a state monopoly in China for 800 years, guarded so fiercely that an emperor had executed his own son-in-law for smuggling it. It had been used as literal currency across half of Asia, pressed into bricks, scored so you could snap off change. Empires had bought cavalry with it. 60 kilograms of pressed tea for one Tibetan horse, 25,000 horses a year at the peak. And 20 years before that race, to avoid paying for this leaf in silver, the greatest naval power on earth had shelled Chinese forts, burned an imperial palace, and hooked roughly 1/10 of a country on opium. Today, 100 of these leaves, in bags, cost about what you'd pay for a bus fare. They sit in a cardboard box next to the kettle. You drop one in a mug without looking up from your phone. So how did that happen? How did a bitter leaf that nobody originally even drank become money, a weapon, and a casus belli, and then become the cheapest thing in your kitchen? And what did we stop noticing while we waited for the kettle? But this story doesn't start in the Channel or in a Chinese river anchorage. It starts 2,500 years earlier in warm, misty hills in southwestern China, where an unremarkable shrub grows a leaf that is tough, bitter, and frankly unpleasant. A leaf that human beings spent a very long time refusing to put in water. To understand why people later died for it, you first have to understand what it does to us. There are 2 compounds in the tea leaf that rarely occur together. The first is caffeine, the same molecule as in coffee. The second is an amino acid called L-Theanine, which coffee has almost none of. Caffeine accelerates, theanine smooths. Together, they don't produce a spike. They produce a long, flat, governable wakefulness, the state in which a person can spend 4 hours copying a document, haggling in a market, or praying without falling asleep and without shaking. The first people to appreciate that were not merchants. They were Buddhist monks who had to sit still and not go under. Tea was a drink of discipline long before it was a drink of pleasure. Second, where there were no vegetables, tea supplied what food didn't. For Tibetans, for Mongols, for the peoples of the steppe living on meat, milk, and barley, tea wasn't luxury, and it wasn't ceremony. A Tibetan tea master puts it in one line. For a monk, tea is life. Whole nations paid everything they had for it, because without it, life was worse. But the decisive thing is the third one, and it almost always gets left out. To make tea, you have to boil the water. Sit with what that means. For nearly all of human history, water was the main way to die. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, all of it came out of the well, the river, the barrel. And then along comes a drink that, for reasons of taste alone, makes millions of people bring water to a rolling boil every single day. Nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody boiled water for their health. People simply wanted tea and sterilized what they drank by accident. In 2063, the economist Francisca Antman at the University of Colorado tested that on data from more than 400 English parishes. She compared mortality before and after tea suddenly got cheap and looked separately at areas where the water was worse to begin with. The result was exactly what the hypothesis demanded. Mortality fell furthest where the water was foulest. It wasn't the tea working, it was the boiling. So this isn't the story of a drink. It's the story of the thing that persuaded humanity to boil its water, and of what it cost. Start with a legend, because you've probably heard it. The year 2737 BC, the Emperor Shennong, the divine farmer, is sitting in the shade while a servant boils water. The wind blows a few leaves into the pot. He tastes it, and the world has tea. Lovely. And almost certainly false. Shennong isn't a historical figure. He's a mythological one. The herbal that carries his name was compiled more than 2 millennia after his supposed lifetime, and in the early texts, the tea episode simply isn't there. It was in the 8th century AD that a man we'll get to in a moment pinned tea's ancestry onto Shennong. The legend is thousands of years younger than its hero. It was written backwards to give tea a pedigree. What we do know for certain is more impressive. In 2316, scientific reports published a find from the mausoleum of Emperor Jing near Xi'an, the tomb of a man who died in Sto Sorak Aden, BC. Among the grave goods was a pressed block of dark brown leaves. Chemical analysis returned caffeine and theanine, and under the microscope came the calcium oxalate crystals that identify a tea leaf beyond argument. But the telling detail isn't the age. The block was made almost entirely of buds. Only the tip of the shoot, only the tenderest leaf. The emperor didn't take ordinary tea into eternity. He took the top grade. Before that find, the oldest tea anyone had was about 1,000 years old. One paper moved the line by a full millennium. And in 22,000 Aden, in Shandong, a charred residue in the bottom of a small cup turned out to be tea as well, roughly 2,400 years old. People were already drinking it out of vessels while Plato was still unborn. But existing isn't enough to get you into history. Tea had to become a commodity. And here the strangest document in the whole story shows up. A joke. In 59 BC, a scholar named Wang Bao wrote a piece called The Contract with a Servant. It's satire. He pretends to draw up a purchase contract for a bad-tempered old slave and loads it with a mockingly long list of duties. A literary trifle, a joke for friends. And in that list are 2 lines the text is remembered for 2,000 years later. The servant is obliged to brew tea and wash the vessels, and he is obliged to buy tea at Wuyang. Wuyang was a market town near modern Chengdu. Notice this detail, because it explains a great deal of what follows. A joke contract proves 3 things at once. that in the 1st century BC, tea was an ordinary market good you could go and buy, that there was dedicated equipment for it, and that you served it to guests as a matter of course. Everything Britain would discover 17 centuries later was already domestic routine in Sichuan. Except that if you tasted what that old servant was making, you'd spit it out. Because for around 1,000 years, tea in China wasn't drunk. It was eaten. It was a thick boiled broth. Into the pot with the leaf went spring onion, ginger, jujube dates, orange peel, salt, sometimes rice. What came out was a cloudy, salty stew, filling, warming, and with almost nothing in common with what's in your mug. Professor James Benn of McMaster University, who wrote The Cultural History of Tea in China, puts it flatly. Tea was food. And at that point, a man walks into the story who changed all of it single-handedly. His name was Rikyū. He was born around 733, and he started about as low as it is possible to start. He was a foundling, raised by a Buddhist monk in a monastery, doing the dirty jobs, including making his master's tea. He refused to take vows, ran away, and joined a traveling troupe as a clown. The author of the canon that still governs tea culture across Asia began as a circus comic. At 14, a local governor saw his act, took him in, and gave him an education. By 30, the former clown was moving among the empire's senior officials, calligraphers, and poets. Between 760 and 780, he wrote the Cha Jing, the classic of tea. 3 scrolls, 10 chapters, a little over 7,000 characters. In length, a pamphlet. In consequence, a constitution. Rikyū described everything: where tea grows, how to pick it, how to process it, what to drink it from, which water to use, how to boil it. But above all, he banned the soup. No onion, no ginger, no dates. Water and a pinch of salt. Tea, he insisted, is an elixir, and every addition kills it. He was lucky with his timing. The book landed just after the An Lushan Rebellion, which between 755 and 763 came close to destroying the Tang Empire. The surviving elite came out of that catastrophe sober in the most literal sense. Wine had stopped being a decent answer to life. Tea fit the moment exactly. So tea acquired a culture. And where culture appears, demand appears immediately. And where demand appears, the state always follows. The state came for tea at the end of the 8th century. A tax went on, came off, went back on, and by 793 was fixed at 10% of value. 10% on a bitter leaf that a century earlier had interested nobody. After that, it accelerates. By 862, in the district of Kunming, somewhere between 70 and 80% of the population lived off tea. Whole counties turned into a monoculture of one plant. Under the Song dynasty, output ran 2 to 3 times what it had been under the Tang. And then the empire did to tea what it did to salt. It imposed a monopoly called Kecha. Trading tea without a state license became a crime. Then something stranger happened. Tea became money. Not metaphorically, literally. Fresh leaf was steamed, pounded, pressed into a mold, and dried, and out came a hard brick that essentially never spoiled. That brick began circulating as currency across Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet, and Siberia. Laborers and servants were paid in tea. In the market, you haggled in bricks, not coins. But the elegant detail is this. Every brick was scored with lines so you could snap a piece off. It wasn't just hard currency. It was a banknote in denominations, and you could make change out of it.
And it lasted an absurdly long time. In Siberia, tea bricks stayed in circulation practically until the Second World War, and Europeans reaching Mongolia and Tibet in the early 20th century found to their astonishment that they could not buy food with gold or silver, only with tea. Sit with that for a second. Gold isn't money. Tea is. But the most expensive thing bought with that currency walked on 4 legs. The Song Empire was permanently short of one thing: horses. The nomads to the north had cavalry the Chinese army didn't. The only good horses grew across the border, among the Tibetans, and the Tibetans didn't want silk and didn't want silver. An official named Wang Xiao wrote to the throne in plain language. The Westerners have started bringing good horses to the frontier, and all they want is tea. In 1074, the empire formalized it, a tea and horse agency, and official horse markets. The Sichuan rate that year ran to about 60 kilograms of pressed tea per horse.
And the exchange was dishonest by design. By decree, tea traded for horses was valued below market, and horses above it. At its peak, the system delivered 25,000 horses a year, and Song cavalry reached 200,000 head. 200,000 horses bought with leaves. But somebody had to carry those leaves up there, and here the story of tea stops being pretty. The road tea traveled into Tibet was called the Tea Horse Road. From Ya'an in Sichuan to Lhasa is about 2,250 kilometers, over 4 passes, above 5,100 meters. No cart went that way, no wheel. Tea was carried by people. National Geographic got there in time to interview the last surviving porters. Luo Yongfu, 92 when he spoke to them, worked that road from 1935 to 1949. His usual load was around 61 kilograms. The typical range for an adult man ran from 70 to 90, as a rule, more than he weighed himself. The strongest carried up to 135. The load did not come off at rest stops, because getting 90 kilograms back onto your own back unaided is impossible. You propped it on an iron-tipped staff and rested standing up. And the pay was this: a pound of tea, a pound of rice. A man carried more than his own body weight over 5-kilometer passes to earn a weight of rice equal to what he'd hauled. That road ran for about 13 centuries. Human porterage only stopped after 1949. Men who carried tea into Tibet on their spines lived to watch television. Meanwhile, in the capital, tea was becoming an art form refined to the point of vertigo. Under the Song, the tang boiling was abandoned. Pressed tea was ground to a fine powder, covered with boiling water and whisked with bamboo into a dense foam. That method is precisely what the Japanese would take home and preserve under the name matcha. Around it grew competitive tea contests with judges and strict criteria, and out of those came the art of painting landscapes on the surface of the foam with a bamboo stylus. Latte art,
900 years before latte. Then that culture was canceled with a stroke of a pen, and the first Ming emperor, Zhu Yuanzhan, banned pressed tea cakes for the court and ordered loose leaf instead. One document liquidated the entire Song powdered tradition. Whisked green tea vanished from China. It survived only in Japan, where it had already arrived. And 6 years later, the same emperor signed his own son-in-law's death warrant. His name was Ouyang Lun. He was married to the emperor's fourth daughter and had been the first man without noble blood to whom that young dynasty gave a princess. And again he sent agents to smuggle tea across the border. The Hongwu emperor had begun as a begging orphan and reached power through 20 years of war. He knew what a frontier was worth and what a monopoly was worth. Tea going out the back door means horses the army won't have. When the son-in-law's servant beat state inspectors at a customs post at Lanzhou, the matter stopped being commercial. On 23 июля 1397 года, the emperor ordered the execution of his daughter's husband. What became of the princess, no reliable record says. This was not a fit of temper. It was a sentence handed down on the logic by which other centuries shot people for selling arms to the enemy. Meanwhile, across the sea in Japan, tea was traveling the opposite way, from commodity to religion. And it ended worse. The monk Eisai brought it back from China in 1191 with seeds. In 1214, the shogun Minamoto no Sanetomo went down after a serious drinking session, and Eisai brought him a bowl of tea, telling him it was good medicine. The chronicle notes the shogun was extremely pleased. Tea reached the rulers of Japan by way of a hangover. 3 centuries later, a man called Sen no Rikyū perfected the tradition. Born in 1522 into a merchant family, not a samurai, not an aristocrat, he became the arbiter of taste for an entire country. Tea master first to Oda Nobunaga, then to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the unifier of Japan. He held an income of 3,000 koku of rice and a residence in a castle. A tea master ranked with a feudal lord. And here is the crack everything grows out of. In the mid-1580s, a portable tea room was built for Hideyoshi with walls, ceiling, and utensils of gold, by the most common account, Rikyū's own idea. In those same years, he was perfecting wabi-cha, the aesthetic of poverty and imperfection. His own two-mat tea room is a national treasure of Japan today. The parvenu's golden room and the hermit's clay bowl are the work of the same man. What happened next is still argued over. There are at least 6 versions. The temple whose gate Rikyū had paid for put a wooden statue of him up there in straw sandals, so Hideyoshi, walking through, passed literally beneath his soles. There was talk of profiteering in tea utensils, of a daughter he wouldn't hand over as a concubine, of politics, and of a collision between 2 incompatible ideas of what beauty is. On 21 aprilia 1591 года, aged 70, Rikyū held a last ceremony for a small circle, gave away his utensils, and committed seppuku. And then Hideyoshi did the thing that makes this story worth telling whole. Rikyū's severed head was displayed on a bridge in Kyoto, and then it was placed beneath the feet of that wooden statue at the temple gate. The carved likeness was made to trample its own original forever. That was the baggage tea carried into its meeting with Europe. And now the moment that is still audible in the word coming out of your mouth.
Say tea. Now say the Portuguese word chá. Same plant, same original Chinese word, but they arrived by different roads, and from what a people calls tea, you can reconstruct the route it took to get there. In Chinese, the character reads cha in Mandarin, but in the south, in Fujian province, in the Min dialect, the same character reads te. And out of the ports of Xiamen and Quanzhou, where the Dutch traded by sea, the word went to Europe as te. The Dutch were the great European importers of the 17th century and handed their word to every neighbor. English tea, French thé, German tea, Italian thé, Spanish té. Overland, by caravan through Central Asia and Persia, went the form cha. Persian added its suffix and produced chai, hence Russian, Turkish, Arabic, Hindi. Look at that on a map. Say chai, and your people met tea by land with the caravans. Say tea or tea, and they met it by sea off a Dutch ship. English has both. Tea came by sea in the 17th century in a Dutch ship's hold. Chai came by land, but by a much later land route through the Raj in the mouths of British soldiers and administrators in India. Which is why, when you order a chai latte, you are ordering, roughly, a tea milk. Two arrivals of the same Chinese word, 300 years apart, sitting on the same menu without recognizing each other. And there is one exception that proves the rule better than anything. Portuguese. The Portuguese say cha, the land form, alone in Western Europe. Not because it came by camel, but because they got there before the Dutch and traded through Macau, where the language is Cantonese. First in, different word. Which brings us to the country that would eventually build an empire around the stuff, and which, at the point tea arrived, was drinking coffee. In 1650s London, the best tea cost about 10 times the best coffee. On the 30th of September 1658, the news book Mercurius Politicus ran the first dated newspaper advertisement for tea, that excellent China drink approved of by all physicians, it said, called by the Chinese cha, and by other nations te, alias tea. 3 spellings of the word in one advertisement. The English hadn't decided what to call it yet. Then tea got the one thing advertising can't buy. It got the court. In 1662, Charles II married the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza, who brought with her a habit that in Lisbon had long since stopped being remarkable. She drank tea. The queen drank tea, so the ladies of the court drank tea. So anyone who wanted to resemble the ladies of the court drank tea. And in 1676, a man called Thomas Twining bought a coffee house on the Strand. Coffee houses were where London did business, argued politics, and read the news. They were also, in practice, closed to women. Twining's move was commercial rather than heroic. He began selling dry tea leaf over the counter to take home. By 1617, he had opened a shop next door dedicated to it, and a woman could walk in, buy tea by weight, and walk out. Think about what that quietly did. Coffee was drunk in public by men in a room. Tea was bought in a shop and drunk at home, where women ran the room. The English habit that eventually looked like the most domestic thing in the world was shaped, at the start, by who was allowed through which door. The numbers then do the rest. In 1664, the East India Company orders 100 pounds of tea, 2 sacks. In 1678, 4,700. In 1685, 12,000. By 1750, 4,727,000 pounds a year. A 47,000-fold increase in 86 years. And here the state arrives. The British one this time, with exactly the instinct the Chinese state had 900 years earlier.
For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, tax on tea gave the crown something like 1/10 of all its revenue, roughly as much as the land, property, and income taxes combined. By the early 1780s, the total burden on tea had reached 119%. 119%. The state took more from a cup of tea than the tea itself cost. And exactly what always happens, happened. A second Britain appeared, in the dark. Estimates put smuggled imports in the mid-18th century at between 4 and 7.5 million pounds of tea a year, considerably more than came in legally. The historian Hannah Hodaks puts it harder. More than 3/4 of all the tea drunk in Britain in those years had arrived illegally. 3 out of every 4 cups in the country were contraband. And here the story stops being about commerce. It becomes about blood. The largest smuggling network in southern England was the Hawkhurst gang. In September 1747, customs seized a vessel loaded with tea and locked the cargo in a warehouse at Poole. On 6th October, about 60 men walked into the customs house at night and took roughly 2 tons of it back. They didn't touch the barrels of spirits, they only wanted the tea. It would have ended in fines, but for 14th February 1748. A customs officer, William Galley, and a shoemaker, Daniel Chater, who had agreed to give evidence, fell into the gang's hands. Galley was whipped along the road and buried in a wood. Chater was held for 3 days and thrown down a well. 6 men were hanged, and the bodies of 5 ringleaders were hung in iron cages along the roads of the county so everyone could see. Over tea. Over dried leaves the state wanted 119% of. Except that the tea people paid honestly for mostly wasn't tea either. When goods are dear and demand is infinite, they get faked. The first method was lie tea. Dust of tea leaves, sometimes of anything at all, mixed with sand, bound with starch, rolled into pellets and dyed. The second was smooch. Elder, hawthorn, and sloe leaves mixed with already used leaf, re-rolled, dyed, and dried. The used leaf bought from servants in great houses and from innkeepers because there was an entire secondary market in spent tea. The third was facing the green tea with Prussian blue and gypsum, and, according to the British Tea Association, with copper carbonate and lead chromate, copper and lead in the cup. And sheep dung turns up in the fakes with some regularity. That isn't a figure of speech. It's recorded in the period sources alongside sand, brick dust, and indigo. In 1820, the chemist Friedrich Opium published a treatise on food adulteration and was the first to name it plainly. In the 1850s, the physician Arthur Hill Hassell
worked methodically through hundreds of samples under a microscope for the Lancet. The laws against adulteration came only in 1860, 1872, and 1875, over a century after mass tea drinking began. Remember that next time you complain about a supermarket tea bag. Your great-great-grandfather was drinking sloe leaves dyed with lead. But the most famous tea disaster happened in a harbor on the other side of the Atlantic. By 1773, the East India Company had 17 million pounds of unsold tea in its warehouses and was close to collapse. The government solved it elegantly. The Tea Act let the companies sell into the American colonies so cheaply that, even paying the duty, it would undercut everyone, including the smugglers the colonies lived on. The tax was small. The problem wasn't money. It had been imposed by a parliament in which the colonies had no members. On 16 dekabra 1773 года, a group of men disguised as Mohawks boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. In 3 hours, they threw 342 chests of tea over the side, more than 92,000 pounds, some 46 tons. And notice the detail that explains everything. It wasn't a riot. They worked to order, broke exactly 1 padlock and replaced it the next day, swept the decks, and stopped their own people from pocketing any tea. It wasn't a mob. It was a demonstration, and London read it correctly. Parliament answered with what America called the Intolerable Acts. It closed Boston Harbor, annulled the Massachusetts Charter, and put British officials beyond the reach of local courts. The colonies called the First Continental Congress. 18 months later, the war began. The United States was born out of an argument about who had the right to tax a leaf. And then something quieter happened, which is why you are probably drinking coffee in America and tea in Britain right now. Refusing tea had been the political act. Drinking coffee became the patriotic alternative, and by the time the war was over, a generation had built its mornings around a different cup. 2 countries, 1 language, 1 revolution, and a permanent divergence in what's on the kitchen counter. Back in Britain, they drew a different conclusion, with consequences nobody planned. In 1784, the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, aged 25, cut the duty on tea from 119% to 12.5%, making up the lost revenue with the window tax. And the man widely credited with talking him into it was a tea merchant, Richard Twining, grandson of the man with the shop on the Strand, then chairman of the Dealers Association. A trader lobbying to have his own product's tax cut sounds like self-interest, and it was. The smugglers were eating his business alive. The effect was immediate. Smuggling stopped being worth the risk and, by contemporary accounts, effectively disappeared overnight. Legal imports more than doubled within a few years, and tea crossed the line from luxury to something a working family could afford. And it's here that the water finally closes the circle. The 1784 price collapse is a natural experiment, one simultaneous change across a whole country. That is exactly what Francisca Antman worked on, splitting parishes by water quality. The result? Mortality fell furthest where the water had been worst.
A measure taken to kill smuggling saved tens of thousands of lives because it made poor people boil water. Nobody planned it. Nobody even knew bacteria existed. But Britain still had one unsolved problem. All this tea had to be bought from China, and there was nothing to buy it with. Britain bought tea, silk, and porcelain and paid in silver. China bought almost nothing back. The Qing Empire considered itself complete. Silver flowed one way and didn't return. By 1810, some 350 million silver dollars of it. For a state, that's an open tap. The East India Company found a way to close it. It had India. India grew poppies, and China had an illegal but very real demand for opium. After that, it's just numbers. In 1729, about 200 chests of opium a year entered China, and that same year brought the first Imperial ban. By 1800, 4,500. By 1820, nearly 10,000. By 1838, 40,000 chests of 60 kilograms each. By the 1830s, the silver flow had reversed. In 1839, Chinese smokers spent 100 million taels of silver on opium, while the entire annual expenditure of the imperial government was 40 million. A country was spending 2.5 times more on a drug than its state spent on itself. So the emperor sent to Canton a man known for being incorruptible, Lin Zexu. Between 3 and 25 June 1839, 23 days running, the confiscated opium was destroyed at Humen. The British had handed over some 20,000 chests, over 1,000 tons. It was tipped into vast stone pits, mixed with salt and quicklime, and flushed out to sea on the tide. It remains one of the largest drug seizures in history, carried out lawfully on its own territory against foreign smugglers. The answer was war. By the summer of 1842, the British fleet had worked up the coast, taken the forts, gone up the Yangtze, and anchored off Nanking. On August, the treaty was signed. 21 million silver dollars in indemnity. 5 ports opened, tariffs fixed, and the island of Hong Kong to the British Crown. In the words of the treaty, in perpetuity. The Second War, from 1856 to 1860, ended worse. Further indemnities, 10 more ports, and the burning of the Summer Palace in October 1860, with collections assembled over a century and a half. Afterwards, China legalized opium. Resistance had stopped making sense. By the end of the 19th century, something like 1/10 of the Chinese population were regular users. An entire century of national humiliation, out of which the whole of modern Chinese memory politics grows, began with a trade deficit in tea. But Britain made a second move, quieter and far longer lasting. If tea couldn't be bought cheaply, it would have to be grown. The problem was that China had kept the technique locked up for 1,000 years. So in 1848, the company sent the Scottish botanist Robert Fortune into the closed interior provinces. Fortune went dressed as a Chinese traveler, robe, shaved forehead, false plated queue. He passed himself off as a man from the northwestern frontier to explain his impossible accent. Of the shaving, he left a line that describes the whole operation better than any summary. The barber, he wrote, scraped rather than shaved his poor head until the tears came. In 3 years, he did what he'd been sent to do.
He used Wardian cases, small portable glass houses, and sowed the seed inside them, so some of it germinated on the voyage. By 1851, he had gathered around 20,000 tea plants. Nearly 13,000 reached the nurseries of northern India alive, along with 17,000 sprouted seeds. But the plants weren't the point. The people were. Fortune persuaded several dozen Chinese tea masters to leave with him, with their tools and, more importantly, the process in their heads. He also established two things that overturned European assumptions. First, green tea and black tea are the same plant. Linnaeus had classed them as separate species. The difference is only in processing. Second, and less pleasant, he watched green tea being dyed for the European market with gypsum and Prussian blue. The workmen's fingers were blue. He brought samples to the Great Exhibition in London in 1758, and the English discovered that the color of their favorite green tea was paint. Nobody had stolen a plant. They had stolen a secret. And out of the secret came an industry. Wild Assam tea had been found in 1753. By 1853, India was exporting 183 tons. By 1885, 35,000. Somebody had to pick it. Labor was brought from the poor interior on contracts more honestly described as bondage. Act made breach of a labor contract a criminal offense punishable by flogging, among other things. The figures deserve to be heard whole. Between 1863 and 1866, 84,915 people were recruited to the plantations. By June 1866, around 30,000 of them were dead. 1 in 3, in 3 years. Wages were 5 rupees a month for a man, 4 for a woman, and did not move between 1865 and 1901. 36 years. A railway laborer in the same period earned 3 times as much. And while that was the arrangement at the growing end, at the drinking end, tea was busy inventing the most English ritual in the world. The story goes that around 1784, Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, found the gap between a light lunch and a 9 o'clock dinner unbearable and started having tea and something small brought to her room in the late afternoon. She began inviting friends. It became a fashion, then an institution. And here's the detail almost everyone gets backwards. Afternoon tea was the aristocratic one, small, delicate, taken in a drawing room around 4, sitting in low chairs. High tea was the working one, a substantial hot meal taken around 6 at a high dining table when people came in from work. The high refers to the height of the table, not the height of the company. So when a restaurant sells you high tea with tiered stands and cucumber sandwiches, it is selling you the wrong class entirely. 1 leaf, 1 country, 2 meals, and a fault line running between them that you can still hear in how people say the word. Now come back to the 2 ships in the channel. The reason they were racing was that tea loses flavor in a ship's hold, and London merchants paid a premium for the first of the new crop. From 1854, that premium was written into the bills of lading, and by the 1860s, the race was a national sporting event, covered in the papers, bet on by ship owners. The clippers were the fastest sailing ships ever built for trade. The Ariel carried over 26,000 square feet of canvas and could make 16 knots, faster than the steamers of her day. And 1866 killed it. 3 ships arriving on the same tide meant the market got 5 shiploads at once instead of 1. No scarcity, no premium worth paying.
That year was the last time a premium for the first tea home was written into a clipper's bill of lading. Then the machines finished the job. That same season, an auxiliary steamer left Fuzhou 8 days after the Ariel and reached London a fortnight ahead of her.
In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, a route sailing ships couldn't use and steamers could. The Cutty Sark was launched that same year, the most famous tea clipper in the world, built just in time to be obsolete. The most beautiful ships humanity ever built for commerce existed for about 20 years, and they existed because of the shelf life of a leaf. And then, in America, 2 accidents changed how the whole planet drinks. The first is the tea bag. The usual story is that in 1908, a New York merchant named Thomas Sullivan sent tea samples to customers in small silk pouches, and the customers, not unreasonably, dropped the whole pouch into the pot. Convenience beat intention. The tidier truth is that a patent for a mesh tea holder had been filed a few years earlier by 2 women in Milwaukee, and Sullivan's version simply spread. Either way, the world's default way of making tea was set not by a tea culture, but by a packaging habit. The second is ice. Iced tea is often credited to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where a merchant is said to have poured his hot tea over ice because nobody wanted a hot drink in the heat. Recipes for iced tea appeared decades before that, so the fair didn't invent it, it popularized it. What matters is where it landed. The overwhelming majority of tea drunk in the United States today is drunk cold, out of a glass, often sweetened to a degree that would appall every person in this story from Rikyū onwards. Which is the joke at the heart of the whole thing. A leaf whose entire point was that you had to boil the water for it is now, in the largest economy on earth, mostly served cold. Back in Britain, though, tea was about to be classified as strategic. 2 days after the Second World War began, the government took control of tea supplies. On 8th July 1940, tea was rationed at 2 ounces per person per week, about 3 cups a day, which set against 2 ounces of butter or 1 of cheese tells you exactly where the priorities were. The Ministry of Food's slogan was 1 spoon per person and none for the pot. And in 1942, with Singapore fallen and the Atlantic convoys being sunk, the government did something that sounds like a joke and wasn't. It bought up essentially all the black tea available on the European market. By weight, that purchase is reckoned among the largest the British state made during the entire war, in the same bracket as ammunition and shells. Then there's the part with the tank. On 13 June 1944, a week after D-Day, the advance of a British armored brigade halted at a Normandy crossroads called Villers-Bocage. Crews were out of their vehicles. A small number of German Tigers, one of them commanded by Michael Whitman, caught them in the open and destroyed roughly 14 vehicles in a matter of minutes. The story is usually told as, the British lost a battle because they stopped for tea. That version deserves an asterisk. The unit had been ordered to halt and was waiting on others to catch up, and stopping to eat and rest is what any army does. But the underlying problem was real, and after the war the Medical Research Council put a number on it. A large share of British armored unit casualties in the last stretch of the war happened to men who were outside their vehicles. Brewing up meant getting out, because you can't light a petrol burner inside a tank. So the British Army solved it the British way. It did not stop the tea.
It put the kettle inside the tank. The vessel boiling electric. The boiling vessel, the BV, first went into the turret of the Centurion at the end of the war. It runs off the vehicle's electrical system, boils about a gallon, and heats rations as well as water. Every British tank designed since has had one, and it's fitted to armored vehicles and trucks across the fleet. Crews call it, only half joking, the most important piece of equipment in the vehicle. A nation looked at evidence that its tea habit was getting its soldiers killed and concluded that the habit was not the variable. Now look at what all of it has turned into. In 2024, the world produced over 7 million tons of tea, nearly double what it made 18 years earlier. China and India account for 78%. Every day, humanity drinks around 5 billion cups, roughly twice as many as of coffee. After water, it is the most consumed drink on the planet. Some 13 million people work in the industry. And now, the number this whole journey was 4. In 2010, Oxfam broke down the price of an ordinary 100-gram packet of Assam black tea in a British supermarket. Shelf price, 79 pence. Of that, 49 goes to the supermarket and the brand. The workers who grew and picked the leaf get 3. 3 out of 79, under 4%. And here is what makes that unbearable. By the same study's arithmetic, lifting those workers out of poverty to a living wage would take another 5 pence, 6% of the price of the packet. Not double, not a revolution, 6%. On the ground, it looks like this. In the Assam, a picker's daily rate rose in April to 280 rupees, about $3.20 a day. The unions have been asking for 600 since 2015. In Kericho, Kenya, the collective agreement leaves a picker at around 2/3 of the local living wage, and that only if she brings in at least 1,170 kilograms of leaf a month. In October 2720, 1,300 Kenyan pickers brought a group claim against the company James Finlay in Scotland's Supreme Civil Court for spinal injuries. 12-hour shifts with baskets of up to 20 kilograms on the back. The lead claimant, Rebecca Nyakando, had worked that way for 17 years. An Edinburgh professor of orthopedics examined the first 7 and confirmed the damage. In February 2023, a BBC investigation titled "Sex for Work, the True Cost of Our Tea" gathered accounts from more than 70 women on Kenyan plantations describing harassment and assault by supervisors. These were estates supplying brands on the shelf of any supermarket. Starbucks suspended purchases. The Kenyan Parliament opened an inquiry. 2 managers were removed. In less than a year before that investigation, Unilever sold almost its entire tea business, 34 brands, including Lipton and PG Tips, to an investment fund for €4.5 billion. The official wording? Shifting the portfolio toward faster-growing segments. The translation? Tea is a low-margin, slow-growing, reputationally hazardous asset. Add the climate. Indian production fell nearly 8% in 2024, and the Tea Board named peak season heat and disrupted rainfall directly. In Darjeeling, the crop is halved in a decade, and by one Christian Aid assessment, by 2020 set, Kenya will have lost more than a quarter of the land with optimal conditions for tea, the livelihood of more than 3 million people. And one last thing, very close to your mug. In 2022, researchers at McGill University established that a single plastic tea bag releases about 11.5 billion microplastic and 3 billion nanoplastic particles into the cup, thousands of times more than had been found in any other food. In 2024, a team at the Autonomous University of Barcelona showed those particles are taken up by human gut cells and pass inside them.
Power over tea hasn't gone anywhere. It has only changed shape. First, it was an imperial monopoly and a license without which a trader went under the blade. Then 119% duty and a cage on a road in Sussex. Now it's 49 pence out of 79, staying in the chain before the money ever reaches the person with the basket. We haven't stopped paying for tea with other people's lives. We've only stopped seeing it because it now happens 5,000 miles away and gets printed in small type on the back of the packet. And here's the strangest thing in the whole story. Everything humanity has ever been willing to kill for had an obvious value. Gold shines, land feeds, oil moves. This is a dried leaf. It doesn't nourish. Nobody starves without it. The only thing it does is keep you warm, awake, and slightly clearer in the head than you would otherwise be. And that was enough for an empire to buy cavalry with leaves. For a porter to cross a 5,000-meter pass carrying more than he weighed for a pound of rice. For an emperor to execute his daughter's husband. For the greatest fleet on earth to open fire and push opium on an entire country. For 13 colonies to stop being colonies. For men to drive the fastest ships ever built through the dark under full sail. For a bonus on a cargo of leaves. It turns out a thing doesn't have to be essential before people will die for it. It only has to be daily. Anything we all do every single day without exception, sooner or later, somebody will try to control. Because power over a habit holds better than power over a need. Remember that the next time the kettle clicks. Remember that the water you boiled without thinking was, for most of history, the main way to die, and that the habit of boiling it came not from doctors, but from wanting a cup of tea. Remember that this clear brown liquid has been paid for with horses, with spines, with silver, and with wars. Remember that the person who picked that leaf by hand received less of your money than the paper it was wrapped in cost. And the next time you drop a bag into boiling water, hold your hand there for a second. You are holding 24 centuries of somebody else's history, 13 centuries of a mountain pass, and 3 pence that never arrived. If you made it this far, subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this coming. And tell me in the comments which moment got you most. Rikyū's head under the feet of his own statue, the tea bricks scored so you could break off change, or 2 ships 14,000 miles from home finishing 20 minutes apart. I genuinely want to know which one lands for you.